300 against 120,000. Not exactly good odds. Not really a fair fight. But that's what Gideon had. 300. 300 against 120,000. Kind of makes you want to run away, doesn't it? So what is it that had Gideon get to the point where he was willing to stay in the fight when the odds were so stacked against him? And how about you? Because sometimes maybe your life feels as if the odds are overwhelmingly against you too. And when that's your situation, while you want to have faith, maybe you're not exactly, feeling it. What you're feeling is fright and doubt and inadequacy. And what in the world can God do with that? Well, let's get into Gideon's story and see. If you follow along, you're going to find it starting in Judges chapter 6. Now, the situation is this. There's a group of people called the Midianites, and they're making life really, really tough on Israel. They keep raiding their lands and destroying their crops and either stealing or killing their livestock, basically laying waste to the land so that Israel's pretty much on a starvation diet. And the hero of the story, Gideon, as that opens, he's hiding in a wine press and threshing his wheat. Now, normally threshing was done out in the open with special machinery and a pair of oxen, but Gideon was improvising. He was improvising because there were all sorts of raiders around who would take his small, meager little crop and also hurt him in the process, all just for fun. And so what Gideon's doing, he's doing the best he can not to be seen. The best he can not to be seen because, frankly, he's scared. He's really scared. Hardly seems to be the stuff that heroes are made of, right? But God has a different perspective. Let's listen in on the initial conversation between God and Gideon.
Then the angel of the Lord came and sat beneath the great tree at Ophrah, which belonged to Joash, of the clan of Abiezer. Gideon, son of Joash, was threshing wheat at the bottom of a winepress to hide the grain from the Midianites. The angel of the Lord appeared to him and said, "Mighty hero, the Lord is with you." "Sir," Gideon replied, "if the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? And where are all the miracles our ancestors told us about? Didn't they say the Lord brought us up out of Egypt? But now the Lord has abandoned us and handed us over to the Midianites." Then the Lord turned to him and said, "Go with the strength you have and rescue Israel from the Midianites. I am sending you." "But Lord," Gideon replied, "how can I rescue Israel? My clan is the weakest in the whole tribe of Manasseh, and I'm the least in my entire family." The Lord said to him, "I will be with you, and you will destroy the Midianites as if you were fighting against one man."
So there's several things that jump out to me as I listen to that conversation. Mighty hero? Brave man? Gideon's hiding in a wine press, not out there slaying giants. He's keeping his head down. He's trying to be not seen, not trying to get rid of God's enemies and make things right with the world. I mean, as I hear that, I'm thinking, did the angel of the Lord get the wrong address or something? Gideon sure doesn't seem like hero material. And the rest of the conversation sort of seems to confirm that. I'm reading down at verse 13, Gideon says, "Well, if the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? And where are all the miracles our ancestors told us about?" So Gideon's faith at this point isn't really what you'd call strong, is it? I mean, he expresses lots of doubts and questions and frustrations with God. In fact, Gideon seems to be blaming God for staying on the sidelines, almost suggesting that, if something bad is happening here, and it is, it must mean that, God's not around, or that God's forgotten how to do miracles, or that God's not very good, which again doesn't seem to be hero material, does it? Not certainly hero of faith material. And And then you read down at verse 15, Gideon says, "How can I rescue Israel? My clan is the weakest in the whole tribe of Manasseh, and I'm the least in my family." It's like Gideon says, well, God, do you know who you're talking to here? I mean, I'm just trying to survive by blending into my surroundings, keeping my head down in society, not being noticed, keeping a low profile. God, who am I? And this is no false humility here. Gideon has a real sense of insecurity and inadequacy. I mean, he knows he's not brave. He knows his family's not much. And he knows he's the least talented in his family. Again, hardly the stuff you'd call hero material. And what's God's response to all this? Gideon, so what? So what? Gideon's scared and God says, so what? I'm sending you. And Gideon feels like God's forgotten his promises, and instead of defending himself, God, who knows he keeps his promises, again says, so what? I'm sending you. And Gideon feels totally inadequate, and God says, so what? I'm sending you. Listen again, verse 14 and 16. Then the Lord turned to him and said, go with the strength that you have. Not the strength you don't, but the strength that you have. And rescue Israel from the Midianites. I am sending you. In verse 16, the Lord said to him, I will be with you, and you will destroy the Midianites as if you were fighting against one man. Here's what God's saying. He's saying, Gideon, it's not about you. It's about me. It's not about what you can't do. It's about what I can do. Kind of reminds me of some Bible I learned. Let me read it to you so you can write down the references. Zechariah chapter 4, verse 6. Not by might, not by power, but by my Spirit, says the Lord. 2 Corinthians 12, verse 9. My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Ephesians 6, verse 10. Be strong in the Lord and his mighty power. See, what made Gideon a hero here wasn't that he was some uber-talented guy or some can't-miss ministry prospect. Gideon was a normal guy, more prone to self-doubt and fear than he was to courage and to confidence. But God's so gracious that he works with, not just with uber-talented people, he works with people like Gideon, flawed people and weak people and imperfect people. And he lovingly and patiently helps them learn to trust him. Now, that's a process that God graciously is very, very patient with. Let me jump ahead in chapter 6. When you get down to verse 33, you'll find Gideon there gathering an army to go fight the Midianites. But Gideon's Gideon. And he's still got doubts about himself, and he's still got insecurities, and he's still wondering about his role in the fight, and he's still wondering if God's really going to be with him or not, because, well, this is a really, really big and scary and dangerous thing to do. So Gideon asks God for a sign. He asks God for a sign to show him that he's the right man for the job. Let's look in on that.
Then Gideon said to God, if you are truly going to use me to rescue Israel as you promised, prove it to me in this way. I will put a wool fleece on the threshing floor tonight. If the fleece is wet with dew in the morning, but the ground is dry, then I will know that you are going to help me rescue Israel as you promised. And that is just what happened. When Gideon got up early the next morning, he squeezed the fleece and wrung out a whole bowl full of water. Then Gideon said to God, please don't be angry with me, but let me make one more request. Let me use the fleece for one more test. This time, let the fleece remain dry while the ground around it is wet with dew. So that night, God did as Gideon asked. The fleece was dry in the morning, but the ground was covered with dew.
So at a surface level, here's what's going on. Gideon says, God, just give me a sign, something to show me that, to confirm that, yes, you are really here with me. And God's so gracious and so patient that he gives him the sign. And then when he gives him the sign, Gideon says, well, God, can you give me another one? See, Gideon was always a little short on faith and confidence, and so he's like, God, I just need to be sure that I haven't misheard something and that you're still there, so would you give me another sign? And God's so gracious and so patient that he gives him that second sign. But then if you circle back, there's something else going on in the signs that Gideon asked for. You see, Gideon's actually asking God for some specific things that he knows he's going to need if he's going to be successful in this fight. Here's the first thing. The climate that Gideon lived in, well, it was much like ours here in Southern California. It had some really long dry seasons. And during the dry seasons, the morning dew was what ended up giving just enough water to sustain the crops and the plant life. And so in Israel, dew actually became a symbol or a sign of God's blessing. So when Gideon's asking for dew here, what he's saying is, God, give me a sign that you're with me in this and that you're blessing me. If I'm going to succeed, I'm going to need that. And I'm also going to need something else, which is where sign number 2 comes in. See, when he's asking for the ground to be wet and the fleece to be dry, that's actually changing the natural order of things, which would have been for the fleece to soak up the dew on the ground and to remain wet much, much after the ground had completely dried. And so what Gideon's asking for in this second sign is that God can and that God will do the impossible, which, again, is going to be necessary if he's going to defeat Midian, because Midian, remember, has 120,000 or more, and the most Gideon can muster at this point is around 32,000. He can't do this by himself. And so to move forward, Gideon has to know that God's with him, and that God is blessing him, and that God can and will do the impossible. And again, God's so good that he gives confirmation. Both those things happen. And so then Gideon knows it's game on. God says go, and with fresh confidence because of those signs, well, Gideon goes. But before we see that, let's stop and make some connections between that and our life today. Do you know the same sort of thing happens today? That God will still give us signs that he's around and that we're doing the right thing? So before we go on, just take a few minutes to pause and reflect on your own life. Think about a time in your life when you really needed to know that God was with you so that you could take the next step. And then as you think about that, think about this. What sort of sign did you get from God that enabled you to take that next step? Go ahead and pause and do that right now. So Gideon has 32,000 mustered for battle. He's still outnumbered, quite a bit, 4-1, but he's ready to move because he's sure that God is with him. And then God does something totally unexpected. Let me read it to you. I'm starting at chapter 7, verse 1. So Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, and his army got up early and went as far as the spring of Harod. The armies of Midian were camped north of them in the valley near the hill of Moreh. The Lord said to Gideon, "You have too many warriors with you. If I let all of you fight the Midianites, the Israelites will boast to me that they saved themselves by their own strength. too many men? Well, that seems counterintuitive. I mean, you try to go into battle with overwhelming numbers and overwhelming firepower. You certainly don't reduce your forces, especially not when you're already outnumbered 4-1. But this is not a force issue. This is a heart issue. Let me say that again. This is not a force issue. This is a heart issue. See, Gideon already has God on his side. And so he already has way more force than Midian could ever bring to the battlefield. But God knows people's hearts. And God knows our proven tendency to credit ourselves for everything good that happens. And then in our pride, even when we're not bragging or anything, sort of to forget about God, to elevate ourselves and push God out of the picture. It had happened to Israel over and over and over again. And so here God says, well, time to reduce your numbers. Time to reduce your numbers so that you will know without a doubt that the battle belongs to the Lord. Gideon, make the army smaller. A lot smaller. And the 32,000 who were already outnumbered ended up being 300. Here's how that happened. Gideon asks, anybody afraid? If you're afraid, go home. 22,000 went home. So now he's down to 10,000, and God says, nah, Gideon, that's still too much. Tell everybody go take a drink. And the ones who put their spears down, said, you know what, send those home too. And he was left with 300. 300. From 32,000 to 300. 300 against, again, what was probably more than 120,000. And then, if that wasn't strange enough, he says, take that little small force and divide it into 3 groups. And those 3 groups, don't give them swords. Give them trumpets and jars and torches. And then have them come near the camp and just make lots of noise and break the jars and shout, for the Lord and for Gideon. Silly, right? Well, not if God's running the show. Let me read to you what happened. Down at verse 20 of chapter 7. The 3 companies also blew their ram's horns and broke their jars. They held the torches in their left hands and the ram's horns in their right hands so they could blow them. They shouted, a sword for the Lord and for Gideon. While each man kept his position around the camp, everyone in the Midianite camp began to run away, screaming as they fled. The 300 men kept blowing on their ram's horns, and the Lord caused the whole camp of Midian to fight among themselves. 300 against 120,000. And the 300 came out on top. To me, that's a miracle. Miracles. That's certainly what Gideon's story was. 300 defeating 120,000. That's impossible. And that's kind of God's point, that nothing is impossible with God. See, the battle wasn't about force, it was about faith. In thinking about that, well, it helps me make some connections from Gideon's story to my own. See, Concordia wasn't always in the spot where I'm taping from right now. Back in the early to mid 2000s, as a church, we were praying about, well, what's the next step that God wants us to take as a church? And as we're praying through that, something came into my heart, a very clear message and sense from God of, well, start a new church in a new place to reach new people in a new way with this small group of people that you're pastoring right now. And I knew I could pastor, but I didn't know anything about planting. And so I had plenty of, well, like Gideon, God, are you sure moments? Are you sure me? Are you sure you don't want someone else? So, well, I just kept praying. For months, as the church was praying, I kept praying about this too. And when it became clear that, well, yes, this is what God wanted me to do, well, like Gideon, I wasn't quite ready to jump yet. I'm like, God, I really need to know this. So I just kept praying for several more months. Praying because I guess that was sort of my fleece, because I was like, well, God, I am willing to do this. I'm willing to go out on this limb for you, but I've got to know that you're with me and that you're blessing this. And I've got to know that you can do the impossible, because we're going to need that. We just don't have enough people and resources, and I've never done something like this before. We're going to need you to do the impossible. And then I got this very, very clear sense of peace. This sense of peace of, yes, this is for you to do, and this is for you guys to do together. And don't worry, I'm going to be with you, and I'll help you, and I'm going to do that impossible stuff. Actually, it kind of reminds me of a piece of Gideon's story that I didn't talk about today. The first time that he asked God for a sign that he was around. And when God gave him that, Gideon gave a name to the place. It's Judges 6, verse 23. He called the place, "The Lord is our peace." Another translation calls it, "The Lord comes." And that's what I took as my sign. That peace from God was my sign. And then it was game on. When God says go, you go, right? So it's game on, and I went public with the idea, and we worked and prayed through it as a church. And when as a church we unanimously went behind that, we trained and we planned and we strategized, and we watched God do the impossible. And we launched. And the launch was successful. I mean, our strategy was working. Now, the church was small, but we were reaching lots and lots of new people. Now, lots of them also ended up moving out of the area, which was kind of hard on us, and it's why we're still small, one of the reasons, but we were still reaching new people all the time. And we were baptizing lots and lots of people, infants, children, adults, the whole range, almost around 100 in the first 5 years or so. And in the preschool, which we started specifically as a ministry arm of the church so that we could reach new kids and new families and new people in the area, that was really booming. We'd grown to more than 250 preschool students consistently, year after year after year. Man, it would have been nice for that to continue. Especially since financially we took on a huge debt, millions of dollars, in order to accommodate the number of kids and families that we were reaching. And it wasn't a big deal because it was working. But as I look back on that now, I also see something else was kind of happening, at least in me, and that's that there was this dangerous pride that was sort of creeping into my heart. And I look at that because I see other people's success stories in our own church circles and beyond, and there was a part of me that was kind of asking myself, maybe enviously and jealously, well, why isn't anybody asking what Concordia is doing? Why isn't anybody asking me about how we were able to be so successful? Why isn't anybody asking me about how we were able to generate people and baptisms and income? Why isn't anybody asking me about this new family worship style that's connecting people? Why isn't anybody asking me about how the preschool grew so fast and so strong? Well, it never pushed God out of the picture, but boy, that's a lot of me in that story, isn't it? And that doesn't belong. It made me a much bigger part of the story than was warranted. I mean, it took all sorts of miracles for this to happen, and that's all God. And it's like I was wanting to claim a bunch of the credit. And then 2020 happened. 2020 happened, which I don't see that as sent by God, but I do see that how God used those circumstances to drive me back to a much deeper dependence and reliance on Him. You're all familiar with that. 2020, COVID shut everything down, and for us, that meant, well, like a lot of people and businesses, we went from 250 plus students to 0. That's a financial hit. And the preschool director and my friend got really, really sick and then died of a brain tumor. The assistant director, who really preferred to stay in the background and didn't have a lot of preschool experience, a lot of skill, a lot of ability, a lot of talent, but not a lot of preschool experience. It kind of sounds like me launching the church, right? Well, suddenly she's thrust into the role of being in charge and reopening the school, hitting that moving target at the time of COVID regulations. And then we reopened the school and slowly started building up our student count again. But we're still not at the level of students that we need to cover a mortgage that's in the millions of dollars. And we could take more students, but right now, like a lot of businesses everywhere, we're having a real hard time finding additional staff. And then, to top it all off, 40% or so of our student body just disappears when the state decided in January, state of California, and says, we're going to do free pre-kindergarten for 4-year-olds. and 40% of our students are suddenly gone. So now, we'd had so much abundance, and now what we have is no longer enough. All right, not nearly enough. And we're forced again, as we were in the beginning, to rely totally on God. Which is not really a bad thing, is it? Not a bad thing. We've seen it before, and we will see it again. When God is on the field, the little that we have is always enough. And the impossible is always possible. 300 over 120,000. Remember? So when God delivers, and He will, I am not sure how, but I'm sure that He will. When God delivers, it won't be me getting the credit. It won't be Concordia getting the credit. There's no brag points left. Only a reliance on God. A complete and total reliance and dependence on God, and a look what God has done again. Yeah. Which actually applies to you just as much as it does to me and to Concordia. If you're thinking, God can't use me, think again. If you're thinking, my situation's too overwhelming and the odds are too much against me, think again. If you're thinking, it's so bad out there that God just must not be around, well, think again. Remember Gideon's story. Remember Gideon's story and how Gideon had all these doubts and insecurities and how God used him anyway. Remember that, and remember that God also puts up with your frailties and weaknesses and misunderstandings and inadequacies, and he wants to use you too. Remember Gideon's story and how God met Gideon in his fear and brought him to a point of greater trust. And so remember that God can actually grow your faith too. Remember how God gave Gideon signs that he was still around and that he was blessing him. And because he's still the same God, we'll look for those same sort of signs of his presence and his blessing in your own life today. And by the way, communion's going to help you with that. Remember that force reduction in Gideon's story? Remember how they reduced the army to 300 against 120,000? So that you could see that God could do the impossible. So you could see that no matter how little you have, it's always enough for God. Always has been, always will be. See, the story of Gideon reminds me that with God on our side, we have more power on the field than anyone else can bring. And that our resources, though seemingly small, well, they're going to be big enough for whatever challenge is ahead. Because nothing about God has changed. God is still with us. God is still blessing us. God still can and does do the impossible. And God still can and does use fearful, doubting, questioning, seemingly inadequate people to do his work and to point people to his incredible, unsurpassed love in Jesus Christ.